Broadcasting from Studio A here at Proven Winners Color Choice Shrubs, it's time for the Gardening Simplified Show with Stacy Hervella, me, Rick Weist, and our engineer and producer, Adriana Robinson. Stacy, today's topic, plants that like to move and plants that don't like to move. And I've been thinking about this, and I need to share with you that I'm not so sure I've ever found a plant that I don't want to move.
Wow.
Seriously.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I know. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but, rejuvenation is a good thing. For years when I ran my business, I always had a small bottle of Tabasco sauce on the ledge because Tabasco sauce always was a good reminder for me that just adding a little bit to a dish can change the whole dish, right?
That's very true. Yeah. I think that it's important for people to understand that moving plants is a normal thing to do as a gardener. I think there's this kind of myth or belief out there that gardeners, especially people who have many years of experience like you and I, get it right the first time. And newsflash, we do not. Even maybe we do and we change our mind and it doesn't feel so right anymore. It's not a multiple choice test. It's an open-ended essay exam. And so, you have the opportunity to, for most things, there are certainly exceptions, but you do have the opportunity to change your mind and move the majority of different types of plants.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that because that gives me permission. And what I'm trying to do is give folks permission to do it also because you reach a point, of course, with some plants where you just simply need to move them. They're too close to the house or you're sick of them in that location. They're getting too big or whatever. I think the key is recognizing, number one, you can do this. I mean, they move houses, for crying out loud.
That's true.
If they move houses, you can move some plants and take a shot at it. I think the key, from my experience, Stacy, is don't do it during prime time.
That is for sure.
And that means for both the individual and the plants. So as an individual, don't go out there and move plants when it's sunny and it's beautiful outside. Do it when it's overcast, kind of drizzly, not real nice to be outside. And the same applies to plants. Don't move them when they're in their prime. Move them during their off season?
Yeah, the dormant season. So I think this is great timing. We did another show back in October called Bust to Move that was more about how to move. And now we're going to talk about specifically plants that want to be or that can be moved and those that maybe are a little more resentful of being moved. But the overall thing, the reason we're doing this is because we are coming up on a perfect time for moving plants. Exactly. When they are dormant, and of course the ground is not frozen and covered with 2 or 3 feet of snow as it is at the moment. So perhaps in another, 6 weeks or so here in Michigan, we're getting into prime plant moving time. When those plants are dormant is a great time to move things that you have been thinking about switching around.
Exactly. And, I guess I think about moving plants. I remember clearly sitting on a chaise lounge in Las Vegas, sipping on an adult beverage and watching them move trees and large plants from the old desert into the Wynn Resort. They were moving some of these plants with helicopters.
Wow.
And the same applies an interview I did back in 2010 with individuals who were restoring the tree that survived the collapse of the Twin Towers in New York and bringing that tree back to life and then moving that tree to the Memorial Plaza where it stands today. My point is, Stacy, the attitude I take is where there's a will, there's a way.
For the average person, some of those things may be a little out of reach. Let's not beat around the bush here. Moving trees, I think, is one place, especially if they're more mature trees, like the ones that you just described, is an area where it is possible, but the expense and effort may not be worth it. And certainly you can find online amazing stories of, huge oak trees being relocated. And those are all very, very interesting to see. But, overall, unless something has, huge historical or aesthetic value, it's not easy to do for mature trees. But almost anything else, even young trees, But I think, as with everything else in horticulture, the key is to have realistic expectations about what happens after you move something. And I have an interesting situation from my own garden where several years ago I bought 2 pawpaw seedlings. So pawpaw are native edible pawpaw, and planted them in my garden. And they're fairly slow growing, but it soon became obvious that the way that we had positioned them was not right. So I moved one of them about a year after I planted.
Okay.
Now, pawpaws are trees with a taproot. So this is something that you need to look for. I'm sure we're going to be going there later. If a plant has a taproot, so think a little bit like a carrot, deep root like that rather than a large spread out root system, they tend to not take to transplanting quite as well. And pawpaws are one of those. So I dug my hole, I moved the tree, and it is pretty much fine now. But for about 2 or 3 years, it was pretty surprising to see how 2 of the same plants planted at the exact same time, one of them was so severely set back from this moving. So it probably took about 2 years for it to recover. That first year after I moved it, it didn't grow hardly at all on top. It was alive, it leafed out, it was okay. But it was like, whoa, I am recovering. I'm not growing. I just need to take a year off. And then almost like resetting, sleep, creep, leap. It was a sleep year for that first year. It was a creep year for the second year. And then by the third year, now they're almost back together. But you do have to understand that even though we do freely move plants around, there is a little bit of a plant penalty there to pay.
Oh, I agree. And when I say I haven't met a plant I don't want to move, I do say that tongue in cheek. I've done some pretty crazy things in my life. But your point is well taken. We're primarily talking here about perennials and shrubs, not necessarily trees. And Stacy, a couple of examples. Rhododendrons. People have said to me, well, you can't move a big, beautiful rhododendron. Well, you can. The root system it's not a taproot. It's a smaller root system proportionately to the plant, and you can stump it. You can cut it back, maybe sacrifice the flowers for 1 year. Another example would be peonies. People have always said to me, well, peonies are a perennial that doesn't like to move. And I'm like, I've moved them almost any time of the year and had success. Sure, you don't want to plant them too deep or too high because you're going to have problems with blooming. But again, where there's a will, there's a way.
And, I think it's important to question some of that quote unquote conventional wisdom about things like moving peonies or even clematis. I mean, you need to do your research and understand perhaps why those beliefs are in place. And I think the one for peonies is primarily because when they're moved, people do often plant them too deep. It's very easy to plant them too deeply. And we've answered that question in Mailbag a couple of different times. But, do your research. If someone says, oh, you can't possibly move this, think about the reasons why. Think about why are they saying that. And I'm sure people say you can't transplant a pawpaw either. And I wouldn't say it was the most well-advised thing that I've ever done. But, that's the other thing about being a gardener is if you're willing to take on those risks, risk your investment in the plant, risk your investment in that time and effort, then, that's your decision.
And are you glad you did it, Stacey?
Oh, I'm very glad I did it. Very much so.
And that's the point. So, I mean, again, some things just don't want to move. I'm standing on my deck looking at my patio furniture. I'm saying, you guys got to move. And they're like, no, we're good. We're going to sit this one out. Bad dad joke. But getting back to the taproot thing that you were diving into. So if you think about some perennials like Baptisia, or you've talked often about the roots on clematis.
Yep.
The heartleaf brunera or coral bells, foamy bells. What about our hibiscus, like our summerific hibiscus?
Well, I just moved a lot of summerific hibiscus and Baptisia at the end of fall last year. So I am, and it is easier for us to move things living in a sandy soil than people who have clay soil because it's a lot easier to expose those roots and to get more of the roots. But I am eager to see what might be happening with those perennials. Now, I have every confidence that they're alive. I'm not worried about that. But whether or not I'll see flowers this year, and if so, how many, will be to be determined. So stay tuned for the update this June and August.
That's very interesting. My general rule of thumb is if it's a clumping plant and divides easily, it moves pretty easily. Yeah. If it's a single stem, even lavender that acts like a woody plant, single stem, more difficult than, let's say, daylilies or hostas.
Yeah.
So, again, And if you have a situation where it simply has to go and you're facing just eliminating the plant, why not at least give it a shot? It's great exercise and fresh air.
And you learn something. And that's what gardening is all about is, it's taking an educated approach to what you need or want to do, making the right decision, acting on it, and then seeing what happens.
Well, let's see how Stacy ties it in Plants on Trial. That's coming up next here on the Gardening Simplified Show.
Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show, where the order of the day is plants that like to or can be moved and plants that maybe are a little bit more resentful of being moved. And Rick, I can't believe you went the whole first segment without your famous saying that your plants have been moved so often they're eligible for frequent flyer miles.
Yes, or I just bent over and split my plants, yes.
Now, I have to ask you something. It wasn't all that long ago that you moved from a house where you had lived and gardened for many years to a new home.
Yep.
And when you did that, did you move any plants?
Yes, I did.
How many? Like roughly?
I'm going to say probably about 20.
Oh, wow. That's pretty impressive. And was it shrubs, perennials, a mix?
Primarily perennials and grasses. No surprise.
Oh, you were brave enough to dig up a grass. That's,
yeah. I mean, with grasses, they're pretty easy to divide and move as far as they're being willing to do so. It's whether or not the individual wants to go through the grief, right?
Absolutely. There was a condo down the street from me, and last summer I saw some guy trying to dig out some ornamental grasses from the front yard. And he caught my eye as I was walking by, and I said, "Ooh, tough job, good luck." Went back the next day, nothing had been moved. He gave up on the whole thing.
I believe it.
So if you're listening, mister, I understand. But anyway, it is great that we can move plants. And I have often moved plants. And when I moved, I was moving in July. And it wasn't the ideal time to move plants, but I wasn't going to just leave them at my rental and not have them at my house. So I moved a bunch of stuff too.
This past summer, you tore out the entire lawn. You had to move some plants too, right?
I didn't have to move too much at the beginning of the project.
Okay.
I saved all the moving really for the fall.
Okay.
Because by the time the whole lawn project got sorted out, I just said, you know what, it's getting too close to hot weather. So I didn't move that much then, but I spent every single free weekend in September and October moving plants. So I'm also very experienced. And that really is one of the great things about perennials and shrubs. Now, as we said, you can't really successfully move more mature trees. You can try. We had a question in Mailbag not too long ago about someone who had a little Japanese maple that was really struggling. We advised them to move that. And we also advised someone in the last episode to dig up their ginkgo that was getting girdling. So, within maybe a couple of years of being planted, 1 to 2 to 3 years, if you get a kind of a smaller plant, a smaller tree, you can typically get away with it.
But if you're going to do that, plan ahead. I still think taking a spade, cutting into the roots a month or two before moving it, try and develop some hair roots will help.
If you can do that.
If you can do it.
I mean, if you thought of doing it in time is really the main thing. So it's great that we can move things. But just because you can move plants and most plants are very adaptable to being moved doesn't necessarily mean that you should. Because as I said, there is a little bit of a plant penalty to pay. It does set things back, and how much it sets something back can be based on a lot of different factors. And the reaction can be different. So a plant might not flower for a few years. It might grow very little. It might, kind of just sitting there and sulking. Whatever other features you're growing it for, you just might not see that, in its full effect for a couple of years. And some plants that people say don't like to be moved really just don't ever recover from it.
Sure.
There's certainly some plants that they'll never really get back to where they were. And you're better off just starting with something that was grown in a container and you can put into your yard. But in all of my years of helping gardeners with gardening questions, I would have to say that the plant that I have been asked the most frequently about whether it can be moved is big leaf hydrangea, Hydrangea macrophylla.
That makes sense.
Yes. So I think it's for a couple of reasons. Number one, because Hydrangea macrophylla or big leaf hydrangea is the type of plant that is highly sensitive to its spot. Where you plant a big leaf hydrangea, especially if you live in a cooler climate, can make or break your experience. You can have a great experience and feel like you are a rock star gardener, or you can have a terrible experience and feel like you're never going to have success growing a plant again. It really needs to be in kind of the right spot. Again, because it has its flower buds for the following summer, all winter, it's important that it is kind of more protected in these colder climates so that it's not getting, huge blasts of cold air, heavy loads of ice, all of that kind of stuff. So it's got that site sensitivity. Number two, I think it's a plant that it is a true woody shrub, but I think when most people look at it, they go, you know what? That looks like a plant that could probably be moved.
Sure.
It kind of looks like a perennial.
Clumpy.
Yeah, a little clumpy. And so people maybe have the sense that looks like something I could move compared to something that maybe is really, really large or, has a trunk and resembles more of a tree. And the third one goes back to what we were saying a few weeks ago about dwarf Alberta spruce, which is that when people get their Hydrangea macrophylla at the store, they're like, oh, look at this cute little thing. And especially older varieties of big leaf hydrangea can easily get to be 5 feet tall and wide. And it can be very difficult to believe that this cute little 1 gallon blooming hydrangea that your, darling child got you for Mother's Day or whatever is going to grow into a 5 foot by 5 foot shrub.
Yeah, I'm with you here. I've seen it, been there, done that. I can't believe, if I look back, the number of people I've suggested move a macrophylla hydrangea because it's on the west or south facing of their home and they're struggling.
Yeah.
So it's easy to say, well, you need to move that plant. But I agree with you. I think that because it has this clumping nature, people are willing to give it a shot.
Yeah, and it does have a shallow, fibrous root system, and it is very easy and amenable to moving. And if you have one that hasn't been doing well, and you do want to move it this coming March when, the ground is finally workable again and the plant is dormant, would be a perfect time to go ahead and do that, or to replace it with a higher performing Proven Winners hydrangea. Just saying, like Let's Dance Skyview or Let's Dance Can Do. But those aren't today's plant on trial. No, today's plant on trial is a Hydrangea macrophylla that is so small you won't have to worry that it's going to need to be moved.
Oh, I love this.
And this plant is Wee Bit Grumpy Big Leaf Hydrangea. So you can guess by the name Wee Bit that it is small. It reaches 2 feet tall and about 2.5 feet wide. So that's a perfect size for, landscaping around a condo or an apartment or other small space. Very easy to incorporate in things like flower beds and perennial gardens. And, just one that's not going to outgrow its space or overgrow your dining room windows. Because I feel like that's what most people do with big leaf hydrangeas, right? Plant them in front of their front windows, think it's going to be great, and the next thing you know, they're 5 feet tall and they can't see out their windows. Right. So Wee Bit Grumpy, small. And you might be wondering about the grumpy part of its name. It is not because it is a difficult to grow big leaf hydrangea. It most certainly is not. Just as easy to grow as any other Proven Winners Color Choice big leaf hydrangea. But I like to tell the story of its name because it's kind of a funny story. So when we get plants in for our trials, whatever that trial group is, it gets a working name, right? We're humans trialing these plants. So even though it would be probably more objective to give it a number, no one remembers numbers. I mean, they need like some sort of name. So our R&D team has used everything from like planets, dog breeds, different things like this, and those become the working names. So with this particular Hydrangea macrophylla trial, there were 7 plants, and they were named for the 7 dwarfs as their working names from the Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs story. And when the trial was complete, Grumpy was not Wee Bit Grumpy at the time. It was just Grumpy was the last plant standing, and we loved the color. So it had this like beautiful, moody, dark purple flowers on it. And it was one of those things that every time someone looked at the tag to say, oh, hey, which plant is this? And they saw Grumpy, they got a little kick out of it. They kind of chuckled.
That is great.
And so when it came time to name the plant, we're like thinking about all these, conventional plant names like, oh, beautiful and pretty and magical, all of these kinds of names. And we're like, let's just go with Grumpy. And what I love about the name is it's still making people laugh when they see it. So, because everyone knows someone who's like a wee bit grumpy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We can all be a wee bit grumpy now and then. Maybe it's because of winter. Maybe it's because your hydrangea's not blooming. Wee bit grumpy can solve all of that. So it's a great small space hydrangea. Perfect for someone who maybe is a little bit grumpy. And I love the flowers on this in acidic soils. Instead of being that traditional blue, it turns a deep kind of marbled violet. And a lot of people think that purple color comes from sort of the perfect pH, but actually it's more genetic. So this is one of those hydrangeas that will turn more purple than blue. If it's in alkaline to neutral soils, it will be a beautiful pink. And, other than that, it's just as easy to grow as any other big leaf hydrangea. Hardy zones 5 to 9. It is not a reblooming hydrangea. So that's kind of, the reblooming hydrangeas tend to be larger because they have to put on a lot of new growth in order to actually rebloom. So they tend to be a little bit bigger, not as large as the older varieties, but larger than the wee bit series. So if you absolutely need a small, tidy hydrangea that you will never want to or have to prune, that you'll never have to move, Wee Bit Grumpy is the perfect choice for you.
Our show last week, spacing.
Yes.
This plant's perfect.
Perfect. Don't have to worry about spacing. And, looks amazing in the summer. So Wee Bit Grumpy, look for it at your local garden center this spring. You can find a retailer at provenwinnerscolorchoice.com or find out more about Wee Bit Grumpy hydrangea at our show notes at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. We're going to take a little break. When we come back, we're opening up the mailbags. Stay tuned. Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified show, where it is our pleasure now to help you with your gardening questions and conundrums. It might be a little early. Maybe you're having trouble remembering what was, causing you issues in the garden last season. But if it happens to come to you and you have a question, please do reach out to us at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. There's a contact form, and we would be happy to help you. And of course, if not every question is easy to answer on air because, sometimes you need pictures.
Sure.
Sometimes it's just a little too complicated for us to fit into this tiny little segment. But if you write us on provenwinnerscolorchoice.com or on provenwinners.com, you will get a personalized answer, not from a robot, not from an AI, but from a real gardener who cares about your success. So if you need an answer sooner, not sure we're going to get to your question, please do reach out to us there as well. What do we got this week?
Well, Stacy, you looked at some pictures from Steve and Mary. Something attacked our red crepe myrtle. Will it survive, or do we need to remove it and plant a new one this spring? They're saying it was beautiful this past summer.
Yes. So if you are on YouTube, you're seeing the pictures that Steve and Mary shared with us. If you are listening to us on radio or podcast, check it out at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. And the something that attacked the crepe myrtle here was human.
Really?
Yeah, I'm 100. Did you?
I did not.
Okay, you didn't get a chance to look at the picture.
So I'm deferring to you.
So, all right, here's the thing. Let me paint the picture for you. So it's crepe myrtle in a container, and it has pretty thick lower branches. Definitely like thicker than a finger, or at least finger thickness, if not a little bit bigger. And the branches are cut at a very tidy angle and strewn all over the ground.
Oh.
Now, we do have a video actually, and we will link to it in the description on YouTube or in the show notes of trying to tell the difference between rabbit damage and deer damage. So first of all, crepe myrtles are fairly deer resistant, so I wouldn't have expected a deer in the first place. But deer also have a very telltale type of damage. When they chomp something, they don't just make a neat little cut and it goes away. They tear. They dig their teeth in and they rip. And so typically what you have, especially with shrubs, is a very kind of ragged, jagged edge that's left after the deer hit it. And you can see that these are very neat. Now, rabbits, on the other hand, have those nice sharp front teeth, and they make very tidy cuts at a very distinctive angle. These could potentially be mistaken for rabbit cuts, except for two things. Number one, they're those branches are about the thickness of a finger, and rabbits tend to go for much finer growth because, I mean, their teeth are only so big and their mouths are only so big. So they tend to go for thinner, finer growth, or just girdle the bark on the outside to get to that nice juicy cambium below the bark. Plus, as I said, this plant is in a container, and I have seen rabbits jump into containers before, but it's not common. And
not common. I agree.
And I don't think that...
those are serious hops.
Yes. Well, so actually I had a rabbit nest in one of my containers.
Interesting.
Yeah, because it was like in spring and we kind of had stuff grouped together.
Okay.
And it was like perfect hiding. And I found the nest because you can always tell a rabbit nest because it has like a big wad of fur kind of plugging the entrance. Mm-hmm. And so I knew immediately what it was. And I was like, but there's no way. So every night we sat out there until we finally saw Mama Rabbit come up and just whoop, leap right up into the container. It was pretty amazing. So anyway, great. Rabbits can do crazy things.
Hair raising.
But that's a good one. Yeah. When I looked at your picture, Steve and Mary, there is no question this is human damage. So someone, because the other thing about a rabbit, human damage.
Someone came along.
I'm not saying they gnawed it. I'm saying they brought pruners. They brought pruners and they cut this, because the other thing is you can see in the pictures that the portions that were detached are just sprinkled all over the ground. And a rabbit doesn't just bite things just for the fun of it. It bites things off to eat them.
Why would somebody do that?
I have no idea. Well, actually, I have a couple of theories. Okay. So one theory is a well-intentioned landscaper who might have been doing some sort of fall cleanup at your house. I hear of plenty well-intentioned offspring who, come back from college and say, I'm going to help mom and dad out and cut everything back. That happens with big leaf hydrangeas a lot. I can't tell you how many people have told me that a well-intentioned kid was home from college and cut back their big leaf hydrangeas. Or, I don't know, Steve and Mary, maybe you need to ask each other. I don't
some
know.
Marital counseling here. All right.
But this is definitely pruner damage. But the good news is that it will almost certainly be fine. Crepe Myrtle, in the South, in fact, there is a widespread movement known jokingly as crepe murder, because so many people cut their crepe myrtles back just out of convention, even though they are generally much better left unpruned. So crepe myrtles can easily withstand heavy pruning like this and come back. And if you are in a cold climate, crepe myrtles can actually come back from the roots. And because they bloom on new wood, they'll go on to flower as usual later in the season. So I think it'll be fine. I think you're going to have to think long and hard about how these branches came to be detached and who was walking around your yard. But I think your plant will be fine. If you live in a cold climate, don't give up on it too early. If it did die back to the ground because of this extremely cold winter that we are having here in Michigan, give it plenty of time. Give it, several weeks into spring to see if that new growth is going to come from the base. And most likely, I think it will.
I think you handled that really well. And I'm so glad that you handled that question.
Well, I mean, I love being a plant detective.
I love it.
And
it's
of course,
great.
But, in my many years of playing plant detective, I've learned to pick up on certain clues like deer and rabbit damage. And this is pretty much unequivocally pruned by humans.
Yeah,
So,
and you're so right. The deer damage is telltale.
Yeah.
Right now here in West Michigan, we've got a lot of snow. And I have some yuccas, big yucca plants that stick up through the snow. The deer have just ravaged them. Generally, they'll leave yuccas alone, but they're hungry. And, the leaves are just shredded, just torn.
Yeah, because they're so hungry right now.
They're so hungry, yeah. So, pretty sloppy. All right, Gail writes to us, I need help with the problem of moss taking over the grass in my backyard. I live in northern New Jersey, zone 7A. There's a lot of shade. The yard is south-facing, and the area is about 75 by 50 feet. Love your podcast. Thanks. Well, Gail, I think the important thing here to note, Stacy, is that plants have roots. Moss does not.
Yes.
And if the moss, and same thing with grass. Grass has roots, moss does not. If the moss is growing better than the grass, then that leads me to believe that the environmental conditions in that area, it's not just shade. Usually it's soil compaction. So raise the deck on the lawnmower to give the grass a competitive edge. Get yourself a core aerator, aerate the lawn. Obviously I haven't seen pictures. I haven't been on Gail's lawn, but I can almost guarantee you that lawn is probably compacted. And Gail's also saying shade, so maybe there's a lot of trees, a lot of tree roots. And so there you go. I mean, moss does not grow on a rolling stone. Right?
No. And, the irony of moss that I have found in my career is that everybody who wants moss can't grow it.
Yes.
And the people who don't want moss can't get rid of it. I mean, moss is sort of nature's ground cover, I guess. And if moss, and there's so many different types of moss, we talk about moss as sort of this monolith, but there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of different species of moss out there. And there are some that are adapted to dry, sandy conditions like we have out here in West Michigan, even though most people associate them, of course, with shade. But you'll find moss in the desert. There's moss growing just about every condition across the world. And the specific moss that grows in your area is specifically adapted to those conditions. So the fact is that if you have it, it's because conditions are right for it to grow. And even though I think you gave great advice on trying to give the grass a competitive advantage, if it really is that shady, the grass is probably never going to get a leg up on the moss. It's just unlikely
shady
to happen.
And compacted.
Yep, shady and compacted. And like you said, the tree roots. The moss can certainly sow itself between the tree roots and soil moisture too. So if you really have a nice blanket of moss going, it's very often because there's enough moisture for it to be maintained that way. So Gail, I hope you're not going to hate me for saying this, but my advice is to learn to love the moss.
Flexing your mosses.
Embrace the moss, because there's a lot of people who would love to have what you have and can't. So unless you're going to make major changes to the conditions that are enabling this moss to grow, which is to say the shade, perhaps the soil compaction, moisture, all of those things, the moss is going to grow. So I would say get yourself some beautiful poetic rocks, get a path through that moss, and build yourself a beautiful, peaceful, zen-like moss garden.
Stacy, my experience in my career is grass grows best where you wish it wouldn't.
Oof, amen to that.
Right? And as far as moss, too, I remember putting moss and buttermilk in a blender in my garage and painting porous pots. And overnight, the cats came along and licked it all off. And just a total failure. So I couldn't get it to grow. Yeah.
So, it's a conundrum, Gail. But unless you're going to take those trees down, I think that the moss, you need to just embrace the fact that the moss is a lush, beautiful green carpet that doesn't need mowing. So we're going to take a little break. When we come back, we're talking more about moving plants. So please stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show. We're talking about some plants that like to move and some plants that don't, and some that are, well, maybe just a wee bit grumpy, right, Stacy?
Yes.
And I had a little poem here that I wrote, my rule of thumb on moving plants. If it's a clump, make the jump. If it's a trunk, it's no slam dunk. If a stump, don't be a grump. If an annual, you don't need a manual. And that's kind of how I apply it. And I wanted to ask you, Stacy, you and I both love Baptisia. Mm-hmm. Have you moved some Baptisia plants, and what's your experience with that?
I have moved Baptisia plants. It is not fun. It is not easy. And I say this as someone who dug them from very sandy soil, cannot even imagine trying to dig them in a clay soil. But the main thing is, Baptisia is a very drought-tolerant plant. And that's one of the things that it's known for, and one of the reasons that I personally love it. But generally speaking, the more drought tolerant a plant is, the more that indicates that it has a very extensive root system to find water, maybe a little bit deeper or wider than other plants do. So it has a much deeper root system than other perennials. It does put out a taproot as well as these really kind of gnarly roots all over the place. So it's hard, but it can be done. I've done it many times. And this year I probably moved, 9 baptisias that I
Wow.
had around my
Okay.
yard.
Wow.
And I was prepared for the worst because when I originally moved them to the location I just moved them from, because, frequent flyer miles, change our mind. We re-envisioned the space. The first time I dug them was very hard. It was less hard this time, even though they've been performing really, really well. But I'm hoping that this is it because I just want to give them a chance to grow and do their thing. But I would say it probably took them a good 3 years to fully recover and start growing into that big, beautiful, rounded shape. But they still flowered pretty well in the interim.
I like your comment about drought tolerance as it pertains to the plant's root system and moving. Again, living near the beach here in Lake Michigan, we have a lot of oak trees, and they're notorious for a taproot, right? And so you have other plants, too, that can be notorious. I'm thinking Joe Pieweed, goat's beard, along with the baptisia. Any of these plants, it can be tougher. But the point I've tried to make today is even though it's tough, it may be worth it, and it doesn't mean it can't be done.
Well, yeah, and it also just means, again, to have realistic expectations when you put the effort in. And, also don't just write it off right away and say, okay, well, this is clearly not coming back because it has been set back. So it needs a little extra TLC. And I think that's another super crucial part of moving plants is you're going to need to keep an eye on them. And you're going to need to watch them, make sure that they don't get too much or too little water. You're just going to need to keep an eye and make sure that they don't get animal damage. And they should not experience any further setbacks after they've been moved. So you need to do your best to protect them and make sure that environment that they have, especially for that first year or two, basically treat them like a brand new planting.
Sure.
Where you're monitoring them closely and just trying to give them the best start at recovery rather than getting established because now they're getting reestablished.
Yeah. And I don't want to just slide over the fact, too, that some folks may say, well, Rick, you're giving us permission to move these plants. Easy for you to say. It's hard work.
It can be.
With some of these plants, it's very, very hard work. I remember a couple of years ago, I ran the Chicago Marathon, and I crossed the finish line. And you start to recover and you're hydrating. It's a 26.2 mile race. You cross the finish line, and I was thinking to myself, I did this for a medal and a T-shirt? Because that's basically what you get, right?
You got bragging rights.
Well, true,
I mean,
but
that's something.
The point here is that when you dig up a plant, and it's really hard to do in your yard, but you move it to the perfect location, now you've got something there that you can enjoy for a long time. So, and they've been moving plants throughout the ages. We're going to put a link at the website. Our website is gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, and we'll put a link there. I thought it was interesting this past fall when I visited the Arnold Arboretum, and I was reading about Wardian cases. So it's named after Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, a London physician with a keen interest in the natural world. The whole point here is that they developed these boxes that are like miniature greenhouses, and that's how they moved plants. They couldn't send them, obviously, on an airplane in the 1700s,
right.
1600s, 1800s, whatever. And so these plants were subjected to wide variations in temperature on a boat as, they travel to wherever they're going from China to London. And he basically was successful in building these boxes where they could move new plant species. Now, that said, obviously, Stacy, in the process, they also moved some pests and some pathogens.
Yes.
That were not native to the area where they were moving. But that's all a part of history. So I think it's a fascinating story, and we'll put the link there from Harvard University and the Arnold Arboretum. Okay, Stacy, are you tired of winter and ready for spring? I know the answer.
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
Very much so.
Forcing branches.
Ooh, great idea.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you a question. So just going out and clipping some dormant branches, putting them in a vase indoors to enjoy the spring blooms. I listed some plants like forsythia, mock orange, quince, maybe even Hydrangea, witch hazel, serviceberry, etc., etc., and forcing these blooms indoors into color. There's a plant that I absolutely love, a Proven Winners color choice shrub, and it's called Show Off Forsythia. This plant is amazing, folks. And in working at the greenhouse, helping out at the greenhouse, I'm amazed at the popularity of Forsythia.
Yes.
Everybody comes in asking for, you would think that this is a run-of-the-mill plant and it's ubiquitous, but everybody asks for it. And then you take the game and you move it to the next level with Show Off.
Yeah, Show Off is, I remember when I first got the job here, I was like, why do we offer Forsythia? Like Forsythia are a dime a dozen. And my boss, Tim Wood, at the time was like, oh, let me show you why. And, these are plants that set far more flower buds on the stem, and so much so that they look like a column of yellow. So it's not just like a little bit here and there. It becomes a beautiful, dense column. So you just get so much more impact than a conventional variety. And that's really what we're looking for. But as far as forcing branches go, Forsythia is a great choice. But I would encourage everybody to just play around. I mean, it's such a fun way to try to get through the rest of the season here and do something interesting. It doesn't even have to flower. Just having some plants inside and fresh green growth makes a huge difference. I actually have some right now, and this is kind of funny. So when we had our company Christmas party, just about a week before Christmas, we had decorated the tables with some red twig dogwood branches, Arctic Fire red twig dogwood. So we were cleaning up afterwards, and I just took a handful home to have, on the table during the holidays, but I put them in a nice silver vase. And they are flowering now and looking absolutely gorgeous with foliage coming out. And it's just been such a cool process to watch them going from this very wintry, experience to growing and flowering and looking green and wonderful. And just that little flicker of hope that you get to see fresh green growth in your house from your plants, it makes a huge, huge difference. Oh,
it is fantastic. And Stacy, you're an individual who got me very excited about Illuminati Tower mock orange.
Ooh, I love those. Yeah.
That plant in my landscape is sensational. And again, years ago in the 70s and 80s, I remember mock orange in the garden center, and it really wasn't much. It was a rangy plant. Really wasn't all that exciting. Illuminati, like the Show Off Forsythia, blooms all along the stem. Do you think I'd have success in forcing that inside?
I mean, not to be a downer, but no.
Okay. That's why I'm asking you.
And the reason is that when it comes to forcing these branches, basically, the earlier in spring they flower, the better your success of getting flowers out of them indoors will be. Okay. And the mock oranges don't really bloom for us here in Michigan, usually like the first 2 weeks of June. Right. So that's pushing it a little bit late. So I would say anything that's going to be blooming more in like the April time frame is going to be your best bet. So Forsythia is a great choice. Quince is, quince forces quite well. Our double takes do flower a little bit later than the more conventional single varieties. And also they tend to flower more on their second year wood. So you have thicker stems and not kind of that more, swoopy, elegant look that a lot of people look for in forcing branches. But yeah, the earlier it flowers, the more success you're going to have indoors. I have some winter honeysuckle, which I think I mentioned a few weeks ago, Linicera fragrantissima, not a very popular plant, but it blooms very, very early, late winter, early spring, smells just like Fruit Loop cereal. And actually just yesterday when I got home, I said to myself, I need to cut some of those and bring them in and get that amazing fragrance indoors. But it's always worth trying. And the cool thing about the Illuminatis, again, you're going to get that really cool sort of rugged, corrugated foliage coming out. It's still something to look at. So it's totally worth just experimenting and seeing what comes out, because shrubs can take a little bit of pruning. It doesn't matter if you take off 3, 4, 5 small branches to do this. We're not talking about like major pruning.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know about you. I'm inspired. I'm ready to move into spring.
Let's do it.
All right.
I mean, not that it's our choice, but we can will it sooner maybe.
Okay. Meteorological spring, which is a tough word to say, but I tackled it.
All right. Well, next episode, it starts.
All right.
So we're ready for it. We hope you are too. So thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. And thanks so much to all of you for listening. We truly appreciate it and hope you have a wonderful week ahead.